Welcome back to the Demystify Sci podcast. My name is Anastasia.
I am Michael Shiloh.
And today we are talking to Steve Keen about fundamental errors in economics. The conversation is pretty detailed and struggles largely with the idea of money and debt. Where does money come from? How is money created? What is good debt? What is bad debt? How do you fix our current over-leveraged situation? And although it's a difficult conversation at times just because we're wrestling with such complex ideas, I think that it was a very, very productive conversation and a very useful one.
So, Dr. Keen's position comes down to the idea that banks are misconceived fundamentally in our modern society, and if we can work towards reimagining how banking is done, we might be able to avoid collapse. He is not optimistic about that, but he does believe that there is a new economic theory available which can guide us towards more functional systems of monetary policy, which really comes down to how well we're living on the day-to-day. So, really cool conversation. I've really made some huge leaps in my own understanding of what money is and what government spending has to do with that. And turns out I was completely backwards in my thinking about this. So I learned a lot. I think you guys are going to learn a lot too.
If you like what we do, come join us on our Patreon at patreon.com/demystifysci. We would really love to be able to work on this project full-time. We have huge goals ranging from live shows to becoming a granting organization that supports independent research. And the only way that we can get there without being bonded to large interests that have their own goals and their own domains is by getting support from our audience, which is actually something else that we talk about during this conversation. And so your support means the world to us. The people who do support us are making our lives get closer and closer to the point where we can spend all of our focus on making these explorations even better. So thank you. Anybody who's interested, patreon.com/demystifysci. We'd love to see you there.
And Dr. Keen's on Patreon too, and that's how he's able to do this research. He's not married to some sort of captured institution that's going to drive his research into the ground. And so this is the new model, really. This is how the world is making progress. All of the good media is not inside of these broken corporations. And I think in the future, you're going to see a real rebalancing of private information chains versus public chains. And anyways, it's fascinating. We get into it. So enjoy the conversation, and we'll see you next time.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The Demystify Sci podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
What would you say is the goal of economics?
Well, the goal of economics should be to understand the economy, but what it is instead, and this is my reason for being such a critic of it, it's a reason to defend capitalism on grounds which are completely spurious. That's what it's turned into. So you have a theory of the economy which, for example, ignores the actual data on the economy because the data contradicts the theory. And my favorite illustration of that is, you know the idea of supply curves, demand and supply, rising supply curve. The theoretical basis of a rising supply curve is what they call diminishing marginal productivity. And the idea is you have a fixed capital, but largely machines, and you're adding variable inputs, largely labor. And as you add initially, you might get an increasing level of output per additional worker. Then you reach an optimum level where you've got the best ratio of labor to capital. And then when you push it past that point, you have diminishing productivity from each additional worker. And then that diminishing marginal productivity is what's causing rising marginal cost. Now, that's the theory. When economists have gone and asked surveys of firms about what their cost structure looks like, without fail, every last survey has found that normally about 95% of firms report they have falling marginal cost.
Okay, so hold on, let's orient ourselves. So basically the idea is, what you're saying is that if as you add more workers, your productivity doesn't increase linearly anymore, you get to a point where you're adding workers and they cost the same amount, but the amount of productivity that you get out the other side is lower relative to the cost of the worker.
That's
the
theory,
theoretical.
Yeah.
Okay. And so what you're saying is that when you go to a company and you interview the company and you're like, okay, worker labor input, number one gives you so much output, and labor input 10,000 gives you the same output. There's not
pretty much.
There's not a different ratio. Okay, how do you?
Yeah.
Is that just because people own less of a stake in the operation and they're getting less returns as workers? Because if you have two people in a partnership...
He's saying that it's theoretically is predicted that way, but it's not actually.
It doesn't play out that way. I see. You're not a fan of this theory.
No. It's literally when you go poll businesses, they are like, no, that's not what actually happens on the ground as we hire more and more workers.
Of the standard model.
And it's in conflict with reality.
Gotcha.
So what's happening?
Engineers design factories. That's the difference. And they design them to be most efficient at 100% utilization. Because you live in a growing economy, you start at less than 100% utilization. So as you increase your scale of operation, you will approach the ideal operation of the firm. You will not go past it. And if you have a sensible company that's growing, they will, before you reach 100% capacity, they'll build an additional factory, which also starts at less than full capacity. So, and also you don't use all your machines. If you have 100 machines and the ideal worker is one worker per machine, quite literally the theory is assuming you have that one worker trying to operate the whole 100 machines. Then you got one worker per machine, then you get the ideal, and then you hire more workers, you have two workers per machine. When the ideal is, it's crazy. It's a silly, childish idea of how you organize the factory. When you look at the real world.
Do people still cling to it?
Yeah. Yes. I'll give you my favorite example, Alan Blinder, who was deputy president of the American Economic Association, a deputy governor of one of the central banks. So absolute mainstream. He did the last survey into this research in the 1990s, a very, very large survey, and the book was called Asking About Prices. He actually said in his empirical chapter, the overwhelmingly bad news here, brackets for economic theory, is that the 89% of firms report constant or falling marginal costs. Now, he publishes a textbook. 2015 edition of that textbook does not quote his own research and argues that firms face rising marginal cost.
Wait, hold on. I didn't follow. Say that. I thought his original research said that they did face.
No, falling. 89% have constant or falling marginal cost.
Okay.
That's what he's in. Okay.
So that's what his primary research says. That's like if you were to look up the citation.
That's what he did in 1998, yeah.
Okay.
And then his textbook, which he's been publishing throughout, continues to claim marginal cost rises.
Have you ever talked to him about it?
Huh?
Have you ever talked to him about it?
Well, I don't think he'd answer my phone call if I tried. But if you look at it, the basic thing is the theory, as he said, if we take the empirical data seriously, the theory can't hold together. And rather than throwing the theory out, and this is a classic thing for anybody who believes in a paradigm, he ignored the results. And so his own textbook doesn't teach what he found empirically.
Interesting.
Is it just a sin of pride, or is there a reason that he's clinging on to this idea? Is there something it gives?
You find the same thing in any science initially when you have a paradigm-threatening discovery. So if you look at the classic, there was Max Planck on quantum mechanics, of course, and he developed a mathematical solution to the many-body problem, but it required the idea of energy coming in quanta. And he said he simply failed to convert any of his colleagues who were Maxwellian in their approach to physics and energy. None of them. He couldn't convince any of them to change their minds, even though he could fit the data and they couldn't. And he said he realized that effectively that's where the old quotes, science advances one funeral at a time, comes from. That's a paraphrase of what Max Planck had to say.
I agree with that, but I also think that it's worth pointing out that it might also progress one dinner party at a time.
Yeah, like Planck had success in his lifetime,
those
right?
Dinner parties. Sorry?
Planck had success in his life, right?
Did he?
Oh, incredible success. But the reason he had the success was his colleagues died. And new people came along who accepted his theory. That's something I actually explored in my last book, the New Economics, the Manifesto. Why does economics not progress one funeral at a time? And the explanation is that the anomalies in economics are transitory. So the Great Depression was an anomaly. Okay. The inflation of the 70s was an anomaly. The 2007 crisis was an anomaly. But you wait 2 or 3 years and there's something else to worry about now. So you can't reproduce the crisis that contradicted the paradigm. And then it's also a very seductive vision of the world. So it's easy to find people who fall for the idea of capitalism as a self-equilibrating system, and on it goes. You can't get rid of them.
I've never really thought about why economics is so resistant to being a solid science. And I think you've captured it just now when you say that it's because it progresses in such a way where the conditions in the present are never quite as they were in the past. And so I see people now, you can go back to the fall of the Roman Empire and start talking about the causes and things that caused it to collapse and then try to put that onto the present day. But it's not the Roman Empire today. There perhaps are some things that were at play then which will be at play now, but just because it happened before doesn't mean the same motivating factors are creating our present moment, even though it might look the same.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
So,
you've got something very different,
I guess I wonder...
This is I might just interject. This is fundamentally a crisis in evolutionary sciences as well, because there's a feedback loop that builds up between the environment and the organism. So the niche is not a constant concept. It's not a static concept. The niche is constantly responding to the actions of the organism as well. And so this is something that there's this non-linearity to Darwinian evolution that's making real waves in biology at the same time. So I find it fascinating that of course economics would be parallel as well.
Yeah, it feels very biological.
It doesn't actually engage in the debate. So, you can't even get evolution. You won't discuss evolution with a neoclassical economist.
Well, I think that maybe the answer is more cross-disciplinary exploration. Because, sure, I find that the people that are at the vanguard are the people that are collecting around them thinkers from many different disciplines and finding ways to put together theories that make sense. Because if all of your, I'm actually reading this book about the Fed, and I know nothing about the author's name, but she's talking about the culture at the Fed where she shows up to work, and everybody's a PhD theorist, and she's the only person who's ever worked on Wall Street. She doesn't have a PhD, but she comes in and she's like, hey, there's a mismatch between reality and theory, and no one will listen to her because she doesn't have a PhD in economics.
Yep.
And
that sounds like Di Natale.
Did she write a book called Fed Up?
Oh yeah, I know the author. I don't know the author by name, but I have seen her work on Twitter. So yeah.
And so I think that this is when that's what happens, you have to just find the people who will help you develop the theories, because that's how schools of thought are founded, right?
Yeah, that's Danielle DiMartino Booth you're talking about.
Yes.
It's a very insular profession, and it won't accept inputs from outsiders, and that includes physicists and mathematicians, unless they support the theory. So, interdisciplinary would be what would help, but they have a proclivity to invade other disciplines and don't like when other disciplines try to invade them. So, I don't see any chance for economics to reform itself. I think it just needs to be abolished.
What is the replacement?
Start from biology. Mathematics, and physics. That's where we begin from. That's what I tend to do in my own work. And system dynamics. That's what we should be doing. So it's stuck in equilibrium. They think everything happens in equilibrium because that's what they modeled in. And equilibrium used to be a crutch in the 19th century when they knew they didn't have the mathematics to do dynamics properly. Then in the 20th century, equilibrium became like a desired state. And if you talk with a neoclassical economist, every fifth word is equilibrium. Now, if you had an alien land on this planet was asked to describe capitalism, the last word they'd use is equilibrium. It's always changing. Okay.
I mean, I believe life itself can be defined in terms of being far from equilibrium. Prigogine famously did a lot of work proving that out mathematically.
Your Prigogine, you've got to be far from equilibrium. You're dissipating energy. That's what life does. So yeah, it's a completely inappropriate framework, but it's become so dominant you can't shift them.
I think people have a desire to imagine that life is a very stable entity, that it can be bolstered, and this economic fixation on equilibrium is, of course, trying to build ramparts for that.
It's kind of like being the court jester for a potentially violent king. You have to tell the king a story that he's going to like, because the alternative is that the king gets rid of you. And the king in this metaphor is the state, and the jester is the economist. There's only so much that you can do to tell a state that you're going to have to be comfortable with existing outside of equilibrium, because that is an existential threat to the state, which has to be a stable structure. And if you can't have a stable structure of the state, what am I paying you for?
Yeah, there's a certain amount of that. I think that's fair. But they tend to believe this stuff anyway. It's not because they're being paid to, or it's in their personal interest to support the status quo. They actually believe in this vision of capitalism, and they think if they make the world more like their textbook, the world will be a better place. So they're actually more like religious zealots than anything else. I've had quite a few personal run-ins like that. They've been quite fascinating, because they think because I'm an economist, they're going to support them. And so they tell me what they think, and it's quite hilarious.
Well, it seems like this plays out over and over again, that all states, whether it's an institution, a state of mind, whatever, the states can become calcified to the point that they can no longer do their job. And if the institution of economics is not able to do its job, then eventually those tyrannies dissolve into chaos. And that chaos is really discomforting to people, because they need to come up with a new model all of a sudden for how things work. And so I think people are just emotionally resistant at any level of this society to the chaos that results from impugning an idea that has been at the center of the order up to this point.
Yeah, and that makes it extremely hard to shift economic, or of course it's much easier, but much easier, still very difficult to shift sciences like physics and chemistry and so on. So, absence of a disconfirming experiment, inability to reproduce the crises that the disciplines have been through, the ideological appeal of capitalism of this is making us believe it's a perfect system, and you're trying to design the perfect system. You're not trying to analyze and understand the real world, and real world data that contradicts it. You don't want to read it. So it's a miasma.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I was just thinking about how there's an interesting overlap here, in that, on one sense, you're saying economics should be understanding how economies work, but what's playing out is it's more of an engineering project with, like, can we tinker at this aspect or this aspect and nudge it towards something? And those technologies come with their own set of problems that we can't quite understand until they've already been disasters. And so, yeah, I'm very interested in what economics 2.0 would look like.
Well, I'm trying to build it, but and there are plenty of other non-orthodox economists around as well. So I'm not doing it on my own, but we're doing it on the smell of an oily rag, and that's partly the problem. We're independent researchers, huge workloads, trying to do what we can, trying to cooperate when we can, but we're outnumbered and certainly outfinanced by the neoclassicals, and that makes it very, very hard to shift.
What is at the heart of the new paradigms that you see popping up? What are the new directions?
Does money still figure into economics 2.0? Because it's like, I think we measure...
No, you're putting it the wrong way around. It doesn't figure in economics 1.0.
Okay.
Money is not part of neoclassical economics, which is insane.
Can you elaborate? I don't know what that means. Tell me.
They model the economy as if it's a barter system. They don't have banks or debt or money in their fundamental models.
Is that Oh man, I
Because
was really
this whole monetary universe is a relatively new invention to some extent, I guess. Like individual states would issue, or tyrants would issue coin or something, but it just seems like this whole idea of debt, global debt, buying, selling of debt is relatively modern, right?
well. There's also
It's only 5,000 years old.
Oh, really? Okay, well,
Yeah. There's a book
I'm
you
the
should
moron
read
here.
by a friend of mine, now unfortunately deceased due to COVID, David Graeber, but a book called Debt: The First 5,000 Years.
That's
And
right.
in fact, human language began out of keeping records of debt.
So, but there's debt and then there's credit and banks. And I remember being shocked the other day because I've been trying to get Richard Werner to come on the podcast. And so I've been.
Which is a bit strange, by the way. So,
Is
okay,
he?
yeah. He is a
Is
bit,
he?
yeah, but a conspiracy theorist. He's
Well-
actually very good on money, but he's weird on other stuff.
But the thing that I wanted to talk to him was about money because he wrote a paper where I think that he was the first to posit that banks create credit when they make loans, I think is what it was.
He did an empirical test of it at a bank in Germany. Yeah, quite a nice little paper.
But it was shockingly recent. Like this is something that's part of my understanding of banks now, but I didn't realize that it was. I think he wrote it in the late 90s.
No, it's actually, well, if you think of the paper where they did the experiment, that was about 2016.
Okay, so like,
But
really?
he wrote Princes of the End back in the 1990s. So the book he wrote on it was actually in the 1990s. Yeah.
Hold on, I'm gonna pull up the paper. Do you remember the title of it?
Oh, Richard's paper. Hang on a sec. Let's take a look and see if I can find it in my bibliography.
But this idea that people had about money 5,000 years ago, I mean, they were keeping debt in terms of bales of wheat and things like this, right? It was still closer to this barter identity.
You should really read David's book.
I started reading it.
I think we own it,
Yeah.
actually, yeah.
Oh, do
Yeah.
we? I have an audiobook of it that a friend of mine gave to
Okay.
me in
maybe
like
that's what it is.
2015.
Yeah.
And so it's like I've moved it from computer to computer to computer, but
Yeah.
I've never finished the book.
This is, I'll send you, I'll put it in the chat. This is Richard's recent, whereabouts I was chat, recent empirical test of whether banks can create money or not.
Yeah,
You
so
guys got access to university libraries?
no.
You can.
Yes.
Well,
you don't, okay.
but behind the scenes.
No,
Well,
no,
no,
I have access.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
Oh, that's right.
Okay.
You do. I totally
Yeah,
spaced.
so there's Richard's paper. And
Is it
if you want to
called-
go back,
Is it the one? Is it the 2014 one from the International Review of Financial Analysis?
yeah, that's
Okay,
it.
so it's called Can Banks Individually Create Money Out of Nothing? The Theories and
Yep.
the Empirical Evidence. The fact
Yep.
that this is in 2014 speaks to your point about neoclassical economics not having a theory for banks and money, because you would have expected that to have been worked out much earlier than 2014.
Absolutely. And they still resisted. They gave a Nobel Prize to Bernanke, and Bernanke thinks banks don't create money.
So let's talk about the creation of money.
Yes.
Okay.
Especially if it's not a new idea. Or
The
how has the idea evolved over time, I guess, is the question. Because it sounds like
Where do
you're
we
arguing
start?
that banks do create money. Is that
Yeah.
correct?
I
Yeah.
mean,
But if that
they
seems,
do. Yeah.
But if the classical position is that they don't, what has changed?
Yeah, what is the classic? But the classical position doesn't have anything to say about money.
They claim that banks are what they call intermediaries. You'll see them, you'll see if you've read a neoclassical textbook, you'll see them calling banks financial intermediaries. An intermediary is somebody who introduces you to somebody else. Well, like I call it the Ashley Madison theory of banking. If you know the Ashley Madison website.
Mm-mm.
Okay, it used to be popular. It was a way of married people to have sex with other married people they weren't married to. So you'd put your name up on Ashley Madison, and they'd then hook you up with somebody else who wanted to have sex without their partner, and therefore you got screwed, but you didn't get screwed by Ashley Madison. They were just an intermediary. So that's what that's why I call it the Ashley theory of banking.
Okay.
Sorry, that took
Okay.
me a second.
Yeah, but it applies. So the who were the banks an intermediary for? Who was the other married couple?
Between savers and borrowers. So savers put money in bank accounts, borrowers don't have money or enough money in the bank account, the saver lends to the borrower, and the bank charges a fee for the to the lender. That's their model of what banks do.
And so the idea is that there's a fixed supply of money that never changes?
Not that it doesn't change, but they have different mechanisms for how it changes, which are also wrong. So one of their mechanisms is what they call the money multiplier, and that explains the ineffective policy that Obama applied during the global financial crisis to rescue the economy. That was strictly following money multiplier theory. And
What does that theory say?
Well, it says if you go to a bank as you get some cash from the government, so the government creates cash. That's one way to create money. You get $100, say you deposit $100 at the bank hangs on to $10 and lends out 90, and then the people who get the 90 then go and deposit that at another bank, which hangs on to 9 and lends out 81, and so on, and ultimately out of that $100 you create $1,000 by a round robin process. And that when you check that out against the rules of accounting, it doesn't work. The only way it could work is if all loans are in cash. Now, when's the last time you got a bank loan which is in cash? Yeah.
But is that a relatively modern concept? I mean, banks are a relatively modern invention, or are they not? Do banks go back 5,000 years?
They go back about 500 years.
I see.
But in terms of the system we're used to today, you usually get about 200 years as your timeline.
Okay, so let me see if I follow this. So the idea is that let's say that is there a first saver? Like this seems like it's an iterative process.
Yes, it is. Yeah, their model is iterative. Yeah.
So who are the actors in the initial state of the system?
Somebody who gets a dole check from a government, fundamentally. So you get a welfare payment. You go deposit the welfare payment in the bank.
Okay, so the government is the saver, and
the government. It's very messy because they don't want to know about banking. Banking, if you do a 3-year degree in economics, will take up about 2 weeks of your lectures. Okay,
That's
maybe
wild.
3. So they're trying to avoid it, and they have models which mean here's a way to avoid thinking about money.
Okay, so you said that it's the banks are the intermediary between the saver and the borrower, and so for this model, I'm asking about the initial condition. We have a bank, we have a saver, and a borrower, and the example that you used is somebody who gets a government dole check. So in that sense, who is the saver? Who is the borrower?
Well, the saver then puts the money in the bank. The person who gets the dole check is the saver. But they do have 2 separate models. I better clarify. They have one called loanable funds, and that just takes the money for granted and doesn't say where it comes from. And the other called the money multiplier, which assumes the money starts off as government money creation, where the government puts money in somebody's bank account, and then that bank account, part of it is held by the bank and another part is lent out, and that iterative process is how they think the private sector creates money.
So there's an initial condition assumption here where they're basically like, there is money. That's our axiomatic starting point. We don't really care about where the money came from that much. There's different starting conditions of where it comes from, but the model is for everything that happens post-money creation.
Yeah.
Okay, so you have a saver. Saver has $100 and puts it into the bank, and the bank splits it up to a new borrower. So there's somebody who, like, I see it kind of as like if the lowest energy confirmation is the money is created, it goes to the saver, and then it goes to the borrower. You're kind of traveling up the slope of money creation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's the way but what they think is when you deposit $100 at a bank, then the bank can lend out 90 of that, no problem. Now, the reality is, no, they can't lend it out because they're holding 100 on trust for you. So if they could do what the model implies, then you'd go to the bank and find you put in 100, you've got 10. What happened to the other 90? Now, that doesn't take place. You put 100, you've got 100 in the bank. And then if you see them saying they want to lend from the money that gets deposited in the bank itself, so they lend the actual cash out. The only way that can happen is that they do make loans in cash. because they try, the loan these days, if you go to a bank and say, I want to buy a place in Santa Barbara, they'll say, that's a great idea. Here's $1 million to go and buy the house in Santa Barbara. And you also owe us $1 million. So they put the money in your deposit account. Now, when you do the accounting, you cannot put the reserves in the deposit account of a borrower. You break the laws of accounting. So their model of how banks lend actually breaches the laws of accounting.
Because what they've done is they've put that balance into your account, but they haven't taken any of the balance out of their reserves. Because the reserves is the money that's actually put in at the point of the ATM or the teller or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, I can actually, this might be a point to, not that we want to do it as a part of the show, but I could actually show you that in my software. Because I designed my software to explain these issues. And it applies the rules of accounting. And you show that if you have, like a depositor could put money in a bank account. So what happens is the deposits go up and the reserves go up. And then if you try to show lending from reserves, which is what they think happens, you have a minus for the reserves, which is an asset. You can only balance that by a minus on the deposit accounts. So you can't lend. If you want to lend from reserves, it's got to be a minus on the reserves and a plus on the loans. But if that's the case, how does the borrower get the money? And the only way the borrower can get the money is the borrower gets given cash. So if loans are in cash, the money multiplier works. But, all I have to do is says, when's the last time you got a loan in cash from the bank? And the answer is never. So yeah.
But, okay, so the thing that they're doing, though, is they're making an assumption that most people aren't going to come and all at once get their cash out of the bank. And so they keep enough on hand for what they assume will be a regular set of transactions, and then they loan the rest. And so we do live in a society where if everyone at once came to get their money out of the bank wouldn't have that money. That is the case, right?
Yeah, but the reason that is the case is because banks are not warehouses. See, the mistake we make in terms of thinking about banks, and this comes out of the conventional theory, is that a bank is a warehouse. You put your money in there, they lend it out to somebody else, just a warehouse. Bank is actually a factory. It creates money. And this is what Richard Werner's work was on as well. It creates money by expanding its assets and liabilities simultaneously. So if you go to if a bank has, say, let's say you've got a bank with $100 million in equity and $1 billion worth of loans, okay? That's a typical situation, and 900 million in deposits. It will expand its assets to go from $1 billion to 1.1 billion by lending out $100 million in loans. So its liabilities go up to $1 billion, and it's got 100 million in equity, liability 1.1 billion, assets 1.1 billion. So they're actually money creators. They're not money warehouse. Because they're a money creator, you're right, they hang on to money in case the households panic, but that bears no relation to the amount of money they're producing. So we made the mistake of thinking the money they hang into in case there is a run is actually used to create money, and no, it's not. And we treat them as a warehouse, and no, they're not a warehouse, they're a factory.
So there's a fiction going on that is generating wealth, is what you're saying, but it's not real wealth. It's just...
No, it's generating spending power. I mean, lending, it's not a fiction. This is the, again, you see...
Well, if you're in the red, right, if it's a negative reserve, if you're actually weighing it against the actual money, isn't that a fiction? That you're able to lend that out still?
Yeah, I guess this is the question that I want to ask about that, if it's a fiction or not. Because the way that I see it is that you have all of your depositors' money warehoused, let's say. And then you're also making these loans that's basically double counting that amount of money that you have in your warehouse, so to speak, right? Where, let's say you have $1 billion in deposits and you make $1 billion in loans. What you've done is you've created $2 billion in assets.
Yeah.
And so,
but I think
when you didn't have the ability to make those loans technically in the first place.
I think that what they're doing is they're saying that we can make the loan off of the thing that the person has deposited to us, because it's not real. Like, the money that we give you isn't cash. It's this kind of
promise.
It's a promise. And everybody accepts the promise. And in reality, we're double counting the money that we have in the bank because we're good for the money that we've given out. But we're not paying attention to the fact that we have to owe that money to two different sides of the coin. One coin is the depositor, the other is the person that you're the borrower, and everybody that the borrower has financial dealings with. And so as long as everything circulates and both the people that you are lending to and the people who are depositing don't both want the money at the same time, the system can kind of chug along.
This is why I invented Minsky. Because when you try to do this stuff yourselves, you get your knickers in a twist, to use an Australian expression. So I think I'm going to have to show you what happens in banking using Minsky. Okay, can you see that? Okay.
Yes,
that's good. Yeah, bigger is better.
One bigger was nicer. Yeah.
Okay, so you have reserves and loans as the main assets that banks have, and then you have deposits, which of course where we put our money, and that's a liability of the banking system. And then you have the bank equity. So I'll just type that. That's your basic view there. Okay. Now you might say you start with, let's say in the initial conditions that you were saying earlier, say 100 in reserves, 700 in loans, and say deposits are 650, and the bank has 150. That's your sort of starting point. Now, if you have a depositor, then what's going to happen is there's going to be a deposit which turns up here, and that increases the reserves. And what they think is, but this is wrong, they think, okay, there's going to be a minus out of here, and you put the money in the deposit account. And Minsky says, no, you don't. You've made a mistake. That's supposed to sum to zero. Okay. So the only way it can work is if you actually go straight to the loan. Then it works. But the thing is, how does the depositor get the money? So the only way that can work, and I'll just make this, I'll minimize this window now. So that's what I've done there, is when you go and take a look at it from the point of view of the borrower.
So by the way, I have one quick question. 150 to the banks, is that just the bank's own? What is that? Where does that money come from?
Well, a bank has to have positive equity. If you want to form a bank, then what you have to do is to you go through a legal process, of course, but the legal process involves gathering financial assets. So you start with equity, but you don't necessarily have any liabilities. So
how is that different from assets? How does
equity is the gap between your assets and your liabilities. If you raise $1 billion to start a bank, then you have assets of $1 billion, equity of $1 billion, and liabilities of zero. Okay, so when you make your first loan, you then you have your first liability, and your assets increase, and the gap between your assets and your liabilities sort of remains constant. So the equity is the gap between your assets and liability, and that must be positive for a bank. A bank that doesn't have that is negative, is actually insolvent.
So in this case, sorry, can you go back to the other window? So in the first case, you have. Okay.
Yep, the first case.
Yes. So in this case, the assets total to 800, right? And the liabilities are 650.
Plus, yeah.
So the gap is 150.
Looking at the bank itself, I started with 800 total value. Mm-hmm. So 100 in reserves and 700 in loans, that's the assets. Deposits 650, and your equity is 150.
Got it.
Okay. So the top chart and the bottom chart, they're two different calculations of the same system.
The top is the bank.
Okay, and the bottom is
the public. So I was going to type a label in here so you can see that. I'm waiting for I've got a very slow computer at the moment. My other computer crashed, so I'm waiting for it to be repaired. So that's the banks up there.
So in the bottom case, somebody has a bank account. They have $650 deposited in that bank account, but they're given some sort of credit loan of $700. But in reality, the bank doesn't, on this transactions basis, doesn't have the real money to actually give them that loan. They have to
No,
pull the money from somewhere.
money is a promise to pay. You did actually, one of you said this earlier, money is a promise, and that's what it is. It's a promise to pay of a third party. Like in this particular case, if anyone had tried their deposit out of 650, then they'd be forced to liquidate their loans. That's the danger we all have in mind. So, we're worried about whether the bank can actually, if we go to withdraw the money from the bank, can the bank actually manage that? That's the worry we all have.
Right.
But the reality is banks are money creators. They're not just warehouses. So like a warehouse can only give you what it's got. Okay. But a factory can give you what it can make. And we treat them as warehouses. They're in fact factories. That's where a large part of our errors come from in thinking about banks, debt, and money. Is
it okay that they're factories? Is that a problem?
I'm okay with reality. This is reality. Banks are money creators. They always have been.
But they're not autonomous entities, right? We've designed them, and they are, in some sense, a technology that we've created, right? Can they be perfected? Is it good that they operate this way?
No, it's got all sorts of dangers. It's good in some senses, bad in others. And you could redesign them. You could design them so they had to lend out of an account they had at the central bank, or there could be some reservoir that they were limited to lending to, or you could have some controls on the multiples they do. And we have none of that because we think they're the masters of the universe. They get away with blue murder at the moment. And partly why they do is,
I'm still stuck that I'm looking at these charts and I don't fully understand them.
I do, finally.
Okay,
yeah.
Can you summarize just to make sure we understand?
Sure. Well, in the top case, it seems like we're comparing the assets to the liabilities of this hypothetical bank, which is in the positive. It has $150 at the end of the day in its, whatever you want to say, its worth, its value, something like that. Okay. So, but in the bottom case, when you think about how that bank's making its money, it's actually, you have the borrower here, and the borrower has only $650 invested in this bank in real money, but they're taking out $700 in loans. So this is whittling away at the bank's true value. However, it doesn't appear that way necessarily in the ledger, because those, I don't want to call them fictitious monies, but those monies which aren't accounted for are still being used to draw income for the bank at the end of the day.
Like that real -50 isn't being considered in the equity of the bank.
Right. I think that's it.
Is that it?
For amateurs, yeah.
Yeah, but so are most economists. They're worse than you guys, okay? Economists have got crazy theories.
I take that as a compliment.
You guys had a chance to learn what's going on. So what I've done, I've put what banks actually do on the third line up the top. Actual bank lending is, if you go to ask for a loan from a bank, they say, that's a great idea. We're going to put, $1 million in your bank account. That's credit. And we're going to show you owe us $1 million. That's the loans. So double entry bookkeeping lets them do that. And you're right. We could actually set up controls, say, no, you can't do that. You've got to lend from a particular account. Blah blah blah. We could put controls on it, but we don't. Now, partly that elasticity of the money supply is one of the potential sources of innovation and capitalism. This is a point which Schumpeter makes very well, though I think he exaggerates how good banks are, but largely, he defines an entrepreneur as somebody with a good idea and no money. And he sees banks as being entities that create money for the entrepreneur. So the credit actually creates additional money and demand in the economy. Now, whether they do that or not for good purposes, they tend to mainly finance asset bubbles and so on. But what they do is they simply write up either side of their ledger. They increase their liabilities, which is where the money comes from, and they increase their assets, which is where the loan comes from. And they've got to do both at the same time to obey the laws of double entry bookkeeping. Now, economists learn none of this, okay? Economists have no idea of any of this. So if you look at the people who won the Nobel Prize with Bernanke last year, I think one of them says, we will define a bank as the duration of a loan contract. And in their model, loans lasted 1 year. So they have no idea of this, and all their theories, and particularly thinking it could lend from reserves. They think that's feasible. They do not know that it's not feasible.
So you say that double entry bookkeeping is at least partially responsible for the ability to continuously put money into the economy for innovation, for building things, for developing companies, for infrastructure, because these things absolutely need money. And so if the bank can make the loan and allow the project to move forward, everybody's better off because you have roads, you have bridges, you have things that no entity could actually pay for in cash.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Yeah.
Okay, so presumably we need infrastructure. So what's the alternative?
Well, the alternative would be the government providing the money for that, because what you find with banks is they end up just financing bubbles, asset bubbles. And the person who should have on to talk about this is Richard Vague, not Richard Werner, but Richard Vague. And he's based in Philadelphia, and he is quite a successful banker. I'm sure he's worth more than $1 billion. He won't tell me what he's worth, but he's very wealthy. And he became a critic of bank lending. Long set of stories as to why, but he said from his own experience, banks lend into fads. So the reason he became a successful banker was he was managing the consumer wing of a Texan bank, a bank, and all the banks were lending to the oil industry in 1979-80 because the oil price had risen from $10 a barrel to 40. So the industrial wings of all those banks had overextended themselves, but they were all doing it. And if you would be criticized if you didn't lend to a oil rig at the time. And the price then collapsed from $40 to 10 again, and almost all those up ventures went bankrupt. So he then bought out his consumer wing and turned it into a successful bank and then a successful credit card company. But his point was banks just follow fads. So if you have a danger that rather than providing money to invest and so on, they end up providing money for Ponzi schemes.
But if they're inventing the money that they're lending, what does it matter that everything crashes? Like, what does it matter if you've lent money to a company that collapses if you just made the money out of thin air in the first place?
Well, they can go bankrupt too. This is what the financial crisis was about. What they have, if they overextend themselves, then the whole financial system can collapse.
But if it's fake money, why?
Well, because people lose their faith.
You're shopping with the fake money. You're shopping with the fake money. It's not fake money. We recognize what's in bank accounts as money. And there are two entities can create money. The government creates it by running a deficit. So if the government spends more than it takes back in taxes, it creates money that way. And private banks create money by expanding their assets and liabilities simultaneously.
But the point here is that what you're saying is that when they create assets and liabilities simultaneously, there's not a cash there's not a cash exchange that's associated with it. And that's so right. If that money is distinct from what they're actually warehousing in the sense that it is purely digital, let's say.
Yeah, okay.
If
it's purely debt-based.
It's purely debt-based, but it's also purely digital because no one's carrying around sacks of money, right?
Sure.
So
it's an abstraction.
You have a warehouse that has X amount of dollars, which are the dollars that people are using to shop and to do things with. And then you also have, I think that what it is that the money that's in the deposit accounts of the people that work for the borrower also just have digital money.
Everybody's digital these days. I mean, it's a quantitative change rather than qualitative. We used to use checks for this sort of thing as well. Okay, so and settlement took more than a day, et cetera. But the fact that it's all electronic now, nobody carries cash. Virtually nobody carries cash. So the link between cash and loans never really was there. And the reason that reserve requirements existed was in case there was a run. So you look at the rules for a reserve account, people say, you're supposed to hang on to 10%. Well, that was abolished 3 or 4 years ago by the Federal Reserve. But when you look at what it actually was, it was 10% of household deposits. There was no requirement for corporate loans. So all they were saying, we want to make sure that if households panic, any bank that's registered by the Federal Reserve, which is all banks, any bank can handle 10% of their depositors turning up in one day. And then if the panic goes on, we can get them the cash overnight. So it was just a way of stopping the household sector from panicking. It had nothing to do about controlling their lending. But economic theory took it as controlling their lending.
I want to go back to what you said about potentially the government taking care of this process. How is that administered? How is it funded? Is this from taxes alone? What's this system of government? What would this look like?
The government creates money by running a deficit. And this, again, people get this entirely wrong. So like with Stephanie Kelton, who's a good friend of mine, if you read a book called The Deficit Myth, you may have seen that. And she's trying to communicate, like just what I'm saying, how banks create money is different to what the theory thinks. The way the government creates money is also different to what the theory thinks. So the government creates money by spending more than it gets back in taxes. Okay. And when it does that, it increases the deposit accounts, because if you spend more on people than you tax on people, then the deposit accounts will increase. And on the asset side of the ledger, the reserves go up. Okay. So the way it's actually done is when a government spends on the public, it sends money with the earmark, put this money in Julie's account and Peter's account and so on, with the actual account numbers. So that's transferred to reserve accounts, and the banks honor that by, for everything they get in reserve, they put the same thing in deposits. So if the spending exceeds the taxation, the deposits rise and the reserves rise. Okay? That's the thing. Now, people think the government borrows. Well, it doesn't borrow, it sells bonds, which is very different, because the banks used not to make any money out of reserve. They weren't paid for the amount of money they had on reserve. They are now after the financial crisis, but they weren't beforehand. So effectively, reserves were a barren asset, and banks wanted to minimize the amount they held. So the government would then say, we're going to sell bonds equivalent to the deficit. If they ran a deficit of, say, $100 billion, they then said, we're going to sell $100 billion worth of bonds. Now, because of the deficit, the government had created $100 billion worth of reserves. So what they were saying to the banks is, would you like to swap a non-income earning, non-tradable asset for an income earning tradable asset? And the banks say, yes, please, and make the swap. So there's never any problem about buying bonds. So the whole thing about the debt ceiling you're going through right now is a joke. It doesn't matter at all. So the government has a basically limitless capacity to do that. Whether it's a good idea or not is another story, but it has no physical limits on it doing that. And so we have theories of bank behavior and government money creation, which are taught by the mainstream, that are wrong. And so a new economics has to get that right.
What would it look like? Would people be taking out loans from the government exclusively if there was no banking?
No, that's not what I'm thinking about there. But yeah, that's if you had just like a government money system. The government. I have to get a drink, by the way. My voice is getting a bit sore. Hang on a sec.
Sure.
Actually, I have to use the restroom.
Okay.
When the government, if the government runs a deficit, dollar for dollar, that becomes a surplus for the private sector. So the government goes into negative equity when it creates money, and that negative equity, dollar for dollar, creates positive equity for the private sector. The basic logic being that when you're looking at financial assets, a financial asset is a claim on somebody else. So if you add all the claims on somebody else, you get zero. Okay?
Right.
So if the government runs a deficit, so it spends more than it gets back, it's creating claims on itself by doing that. That's how it creates money. And
Right.
it backs that effectively by owning the country. So the non-financial asset of the nominal value of America is what backs the capacity of the American government to create money like that. Now, the government does it, if it goes into negative equity, then on balance, the rest of the economy is an identical positive equity. In that situation, if you have positive equity, you don't need to borrow as much because you've got actually spare cash. So if you look back in the 50s and 60s, when the government was running a substantial deficit, people weren't borrowing all that much. Two reasons. One, they'd been through the Great Depression of the Second World War. They were very wary about being in debt. But they didn't need to, because the government was creating net financial assets for them by running a deficit. So when you have a substantial deficit, there's less need to borrow in the first place.
And what dangers are associated with running a substantial deficit? Because it seems like people are panicking about this all the time.
Yeah, they're panicking for reasons which I just wrote a blog piece about Henry Ford and Thomas Edison were trying to say, stop panicking. This is normal behavior for a government. But they do panic about runaway inflation. Now, the only times they had runaway inflation or hyperinflation event has been in the case of things like the Weimar Republic or Zimbabwe. Weimar Republic, where the French tried to destroy the German economy, and the Germans continue paying reparations. That was, by the way, 10 years before Hitler. People think Weimar inflation led to Hitler. No, it was actually austerity that led to Hitler. A serious period of austerity in the early 1930s.
Well, Hitler was very much a product of the decisions that were made earlier to some extent, or the activities.
Oh, he was. Yeah, but what got into power was austerity.
The government running up this deficit by injecting money into the system, the government inherently inflates the money supply, right? This seems like
but you have a growing economy. You're going to have a growing money supply as well. Okay.
Right, and one thing I came across when I was getting ready to talk to you was the idea that deflation could also be dangerous and lead to different catastrophes. How does that work?
Well, the person who first realized that was Irving Fisher back in the 1930s in a paper called The Debt Deflation Theory of Great Depressions, and happened to him personally. So if you have borrowed a large amount of money and you're heavily in debt and prices are falling, then as a business, what you'll do is you'll cut your own prices and try to attack people inside your own doors. So you manage to pay your debts while your competitors don't. Trouble is your competitors do the same thing. So the price level falls more than the debt level falls, and in fact your actual effective level of debt rises. Now empirically, that's what happened between 1929 and 1933. When you look at the level of private debt in America, it was falling from 1930 to 1933, but the debt ratio was rising. And the reason was the GDP was falling faster than the debt was falling, because GDP was falling, say, 10% and prices were falling by 10%. They had a 20% plus fall in nominal GDP as people paid their debt down by 10%. So the debt ratio rose between 1930 and 1933, even though the level of debt fell. So that's the real danger. And there's no way out of that unless you have an alternative source of money creation. Because if you have to continue, or you have bankruptcy on a grand scale, bankruptcy writes the debt off, but it also destroys the money. So you have this collapsing process.
So interesting, because normally we think about inflation as being the painful piece of the puzzle, right? We see the prices go up in the store for basic commodities, and we experience that as painful, as opposed to the more meta crisis of the strain on the financial structures themselves.
And that's the main danger. And that's my first blog was called debtdeflation.com for that reason.
So, but the idea is that you would always have a source of money, and it seems like a really hard balance to strike, because if you have too much money, you do have hyperinflation, right?
Yeah. Well, hyperinflation tends to be destructive of resources and people trying to paper over the destruction. That's, like in Zimbabwe, it was, kicking all the white farmers off the farms and expecting their workers to be able to take their places when they didn't have the training or the resources. And you had a collapse in economic output of Zimbabwe, and then they just continued pumping out money and pensions and so on. So that sort of experience, about 3 countries have experienced it. Germany, obviously, after the First World War, Argentina to a large degree, and then also Zimbabwe. Never a country like America or Britain, and never a country that hadn't been through some sort of large-scale destruction. So it's something which the Weimar Republic really scarred our minds, globally for a long, long time. But it wasn't necessarily the widespread phenomenon we're always afraid of. So people think running a deficit will cause we're going to end up in Zimbabwe. If you look at the average deficit for the American economy between 1900 and 2014, it's 2.5% of GDP every year on average. Okay? take out the wars, it's 2.3% of GDP every year. So it's a normal situation for a government to run a deficit, and it tends to be related to the rate of growth of the economy.
And so are you suggesting that hyperinflation isn't a risk after something like, let's say we go to universal basic income and the government starts to just make that money out of nothing?
Well, government. I mean, the lesson from Zimbabwe and from the Weimar Republic is that chaotic events can happen that lead very quickly to your government becoming ineffective and corrupted in certain ways that it can make really bad decisions.
Like if you have a collapse of expertise.
Yes.
Okay. But what I'm saying is that that's a given. But many people are worried that the government creating more money is what causes hyperinflation as well. And are you suggesting that that's not the case?
Not the case. Not America's had 120 years of running a deficit, with a few exceptions. And the two exceptions, the main outstanding exceptions, were the 1920s and the late 1990s. And after both of them, you had a financial crisis. Because if you look at what was actually going on, the government was worried, sick about its own level of debt and ignoring private debt. So during the Great Depression, during the 1920s, Coolidge paid the level of government debt down from 30% of GDP to about 15%, and thought what a fabulous job he'd done, and that's why the economy boomed. At the same time, the private sector went from about 50% of GDP to 150%. That's why the boom actually occurred. And to some extent, you can see them being forced into it, not completely, but you borrow money because the government's creating less, so you need to get it from somewhere else.
A lot of people... I'm sorry, go ahead.
A lot of obsession about government debt ignores the important one, which is private debt. You have to include them both.
And so what you're saying is that as the government decreases its debt, the people are increasing their debt.
That can happen for a simple reason, and that is that the government cases debt down, it's actually taking money out of your bank account. Okay. It's taxing more than it's spending. Therefore, it's reducing the amount of money in existence. Now, if you're trying to pay your bills and, grow your economy, grow your company and so on, you are likely to think, I haven't got enough money, I better borrow some from the bank. And that'll often end up being, you get caught up in a speculative bubble. So in the 1920s, as the Coolidge was reducing the money supply by running a 1% of GDP surplus every year, the private sector was borrowing 5% of GDP every year, and a lot of that was in margin loans. And margin loans went from about 1% of GDP to 10% across the Great Depression, across the Roaring '20s. And that meant that a 10% fall in the value of the stock market could wipe everybody out, which it did. So by obsessing about government debt, we ignore private debt. And that is when you look at the empirical data, when you look at when crises have occurred, it's always been a private debt crisis, not government debt.
So I was going to say, a lot of people are under the impression that the immediate recession that we're experiencing and just the financial struggles right now are a direct result of these huge government payouts that occurred in the last few decades.
And it's actually the opposite. It's the opposite.
Yeah, break that down for me.
Yeah. If the government hadn't done those payouts, we'd all be bankrupt now. Because because of lockdowns, because of people not wanting to go to restaurants or catch planes and so on, a huge number of people had no cash flow. If you had no cash flow and you've got financial commitments, you'll go bankrupt. And that would have cascaded through the whole financial system. So if the government hadn't spent that money, we would have had a financial crisis.
And what about
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Because it did spend it, we had the shortest recession in the history of America.
And how does the present financial crisis relate to this? Where do you trace that back to?
You don't really have a financial crisis. You have rising inflation, and inflation has many.
Well, the stock market tanked, right?
What's it down? I don't bother following the stock market anymore. What's it fell about 30%?
I mean, it crashed out pretty hard at the beginning of last year. I think it was.
Yeah.
nothing like the 30s, but it did take a pretty
It
serious
fell about
hit.
30%, which is fairly substantial. But the basic logic there is that you had rising interest rates, and you had people who'd borrowed money to buy shares. They're forced to sell their margin debt, and when they sell the margin debt, the shares go down. And the same thing with, you had simultaneously falling share market and falling bond values. That was the really weird thing about last year. So when you put rates up, necessarily bond prices fall. But people normally think, well, that means, safe assets are more expensive, so risky assets will rise. But risky assets also fell because they're also highly geared. People were liquidating shareholdings to pay debt, etc., etc. But margin debt really does drive the stock market, and margin debt went into reverse starting in October of last year.
Can you break down margin debt for me?
Well, margin debt is when you go to a stockbroker and say you want to borrow $10,000 worth of shares, and they say, "Oh, why don't you buy $20,000 worth of shares? Take out a margin loan with me, and if the share market goes up by 10%, you make a 20% gain." Now, back in the 1920s, it was 10% deposit. So you could walk into a share broker with $1,000, and they say, "We'll buy $10,000 worth of shares for you." And therefore the share market goes up by 10%, you double your money. Isn't that great?
I see. Same process we were talking about before, basically.
Yeah. The negative is if the shares go down by 10%, you get wiped out. And in a margin loan, it's unlimited liability. So if you have, and you're required to keep the account at the base level. So if you had back in my Irving Fisher's day, if you took out $10,000 worth of shares, or $10,000 to buy shares, and took out a margin loan of $90,000, you'd have $100,000 worth of shares. And then if the share market goes up by 10%, you double your money. But if the market goes down by 10%, you've gone from $100,000 worth to $90,000 worth. So the broker is entitled to what they call a margin call. That means they ring you up and say, "You've got to top up your account back to $100,000. Now, if you answer, "Well, I haven't got $10,000 in cash," they say, "What have you got you can sell straight away?" Your Rolls Royce, your wife, etc., etc. Okay, so you see those stickers from the 1920s, people selling a Rolls Royce or whatever else that's why they're mentioning their margin call, because they simply had to liquidate or they lost everything else. So that's margin loans, which are incredibly dangerous. We did, after the Great Depression, we reduced the maximum margin loan from 90% to 10% deposit to 50%, but they still allow them.
That is fascinating.
And they're now the largest they have been since the Great Depression.
Oh, they are enlarging again.
They hit 4% of GDP, which is the most they've been since the Great Depression, when they hit 10% of GDP.
Oh, that's fascinating. So do you, how do you personally, if you don't mess with the stock market, how do you keep savings?
I don't. I own my house outright. We had a pension scheme called superannuation in Australia, and I basically use that to do my savings. But I'm a bit too much of a child of the 60s. I haven't played the financially responsible adult.
Oh, that's so fascinating.
I haven't gambled. I haven't speculated.
Well, I think that people save in order to get to a point where they no longer have to be producers.
Yeah, fundamentally, it's what people do.
And so, are you planning on just working until the day you die?
Well, I've got plenty to fight in neoclassical economics, so the answer pretty much to that is yes.
I think that's an interesting point, right? Because there's two different types of people in the world: those who work to live and those who live to work. And the people who work to live are going to be the ones that are excited about retirement, because then they get to just tap out. But there's always going to be a group of people that are interested in just continuing for forever. But if you just keep cash as instead of savings, then aren't you losing money at a time of inflation aggressively?
Yeah, if I was in here for personal financial reasons, I'd be doing a very different life to what I'm leading. So I've been campaigning against economic theory for 50 years. And as it happens, that's ended up with me having a moderately comfortable lifestyle, because I'm supported on Patreon and Substack. And my views are in demand in various ways, and that keeps me ticking over. And that's really what I want to focus on. I'm not after making a fortune or having a huge retirement just to stop working. And as an intellectual, because I'm interested in what I'm doing, I'll continue doing it to the day I die.
Yeah, I think
I'm
the
not
key
saying
is
it's a
being an
safe way to
intellectual,
behave.
right?
Yeah.
The key is being able to make your money intellectually, I suppose, in that sense, because I feel like, I don't know what the proportion of the population is, but I feel like most people are probably not doing intellectual labor that can work until they're 90 years old and croak.
I think that there's
Yeah.
also how many of them are doing labor that people really value. Because if you can find an audience with your intellectual labor that's different than working on something that maybe never hits or never lands, or you never figure out quite how to present to people.
Well, yeah, it's hard. It's not an easy thing to be, to succeed in any intellectual space. There's always a few people who succeed and a lot of people who are scrambling really hard.
Yeah. Who's
Yeah.
your audience, would you say?
Oh, a large part of it is like a substantial part of it is young students who are critical of economic theory. So I have a substantial number of supporters because they can't pay me all that much. Then you have engineers, a lot of engineers who support me because they understand what I'm doing from an engineering point of view. Some people in financial services, and a lot of people who in some ways would like to do what I'm doing and aren't. So in a vicarious way, by supporting me, they're doing what they'd like to do.
Do you imagine that the ideas that you're putting out would be used by economists and engineers and people involved in financial systems to enact reform?
That's why I'm doing it. But you can't reform what you don't understand. So the very first point is getting the understanding right. And that's why I built Minsky as a software package to make it possible to understand monetary dynamics and so on. And that's why I'm working on economic theory and saying, unless we have a theory which actually describes the world in which we live, then our reforms are going to be counterproductive and destructive. And that's what I think economic theory has done. So its so-called reforms have made capitalism work less well. But because we're caught up in the maelstrom, we can't actually go back and reverse those changes. So we end up accepting them as part of reality when they were actually forced on us by economic theory. Things like privatizing education, privatizing transportation, rail systems, and so on. That was all following neoclassical ideology. And we got used to it. We think it's normal, but it wasn't normal. These were actually public assets at one stage. So I do want to reform both how we think about the economy and how we manage it. And I think the real problem is we're managing it using a theory which is factually and logically false. And therefore, what they call reforms end up being deforms.
I mean, the alternative extreme socialism played out for the West in the form of the Soviet Union too, which I think was such an utter disaster that it has scarred the collective consciousness of the West. And maybe there's a pendulum that's swinging there to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's a yin-yang thing. There are some things with the public that goes much better than private and vice versa. And what we've had is ideologies pushing us to one extreme or the other. And I love the expression about Buddha, describing, developing his idea of the yin and yang approach to a philosophy by overhearing an instructor teaching a young lyre player in a boat going past how to play the lyre and saying, no, if it's too tight, if it's too loose, you won't get a note. And if it's too tight, the note will be wrong. And he said it's a balance. Okay. So Western civilization ends up with this obsession about one extreme or the other. And really what you've got is a yin-yang situation. You need both of them. And I'd just like us to realize that and have a balanced position about public versus private, which we've never done. And I think we'll never achieve it. How
would you break things down, public versus private?
A large part of it is how long does how essential is the item you're looking at? Okay. How important is cost versus reliability? And how long do the assets last that are involved? If you have assets which last 15, 20, 30, 50, 100 years, like dams, power lines, things of that nature, then you want the public service taking care of them because you'll have the long-term perspective. Your responsibility is to make sure it's there when you retire. If the private sector, you want a 3-month return, bring out a new form of chocolate, et cetera, then that's where the private sector will excel. because you want that fast return. So it's partly durability, it's partly how essential it is. Now, can you do without electricity for a day? Can you have intermittent electricity supplies? No, not for a functioning society. That's the sort of thing where you would want public provision. But it doesn't have to be public ownership. It can be public ownership, but not public provision. Like, for example, I had a very funny event which sort of combined socialism and capitalism. The president of the Communist Party of South Korea visited me in Australia because I'm a very renowned writer on Marx. And we didn't exactly hit it off, putting it mildly. But anyway, when he arrived, this is a socialist, okay? Communist Party member in South Korea. He went around his apartment with an Ethernet cable, trying to find where to plug the Ethernet cable in. I said, there is none. He said, well, how do you get internet here? Oh, we use dial-up modems. That's so primitive, he said. Why do you have that? He said, in South Korea, the government told all the companies they had to make sure every house had a T100 connection, basically Ethernet connection. And the government didn't care how they did it. It was just a condition to operate as a telecommunications company. You had to be part of a consortium to make sure every house in South Korea had a T100 connection. I think it's called T100. I've forgotten the actual digit. So that's why we have things like Samsung and Hyundai, et cetera, and such technology coming out of Korea. The government provided the foundation. Whereas countries that are obsessed about privatizing that, you've had, ineffective. You could never get the critical scale of operation for the private sector because the public sector wasn't the provider of this fundamental infrastructure. So there are many, many areas where I'd say the government should provide, and that's where durability and reliability are essential.
Mm. Where do you draw the line when it comes to something like internet infrastructure, like online, like info sources and social media platforms?
You mean like software?
Yeah. Do you view these as potentially public?
Software's private. Hardware, like in case of if you wanted to have the best hardware backbone for internet, you want to have optical fiber to every house.
But wouldn't you want to also have the best search engine possible that was unbiased, and that when you want to have the best public?
That's a good point. Yeah. So there's some elements like a search engine. You would not want that being biased to particular commercial interests.
And it is right now, right?
Yeah, it is definitely. So that's a good example where in software you'd like that to be public provided to stop being monopoly deals being done and you're being screwed without knowing it's happening. So yeah, search engines are a good example of something which should be a public amenity. But at the same time, the development of those engines came out of the private sector. But the internet itself, of course, was government creation. DARPA was where the internet was born. So there's no simple, easy solution all the way down. But you have to make decisions like that, to make a sensible choice, not ideology.
Right. And you, at that point, run into the conundrum of hoping to God that your government isn't corrupt and that it's capable of making those objective resources too, that they're not, playing tricks on you as you go, especially when it comes to information distribution. This is something, some of the founding fathers of our country were very clear about how they'd much rather have a free press than, any other aspect of freedom, because the ability for a democracy to make sense of what's happening is at the heart of its ability to function and make good decisions. So I don't know. I'm not sure what the solution to that is. It's it's scary in either sense.
Like I was involved in the media business for a long time before I became an academic. And when I saw the internet developing, I thought, well, the newspapers have to work out a micropayment system. Otherwise they'll fail. And they didn't, and they have. And so the quality of media is far lower now than it was, say, 40, 50 years ago, when classified ads gave them the rivers of cash, as they used to say, that enabled them to have a large staff of journalists and a good research team and so on. Now they haven't got it anymore, and they're struggling, and it's terrible on that front. So yeah, but you've got moguls like Mike Murdoch dominating the press, and you get an incredibly distorted system coming out of it. So some places you need both private and public, and that's, I think, the media is a good example. You'd like to have a public broadcaster that can at least stop the outrageous claims of the private sector when you get the Murdoch end of the world. dominating what people think is happening in the real world.
Well, that's what's strange. Those private sector media outlets seem to be heavily influenced by partisan politics at the end of the day. It's almost like, I mean, I think that's part of the reason that they've become less attractive to most people. That's why these alternative media sites are where people are getting their news, from, even if it's from Substack or something like that. People are interested in unburdening themselves from that clearly captured superstructure.
And yet none of them want to turn to the government. I don't think that there's anybody who's tired of privately held media and believes that the answer is to have the government put out the media, right?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, to me, there are decent public broadcasters, like the Australian Broadcasting Commission is a decent public broadcaster. The BBC is actually become rather dominated by MI5, which is a long story. That was exposed by the BBC, funnily enough.
And the same is true with our CNN or, these places have also, there's been disclosures about...
The CIA operation, I think, in the 60s was called Project Mockingbird.
Mockingbird, that's it, yeah. So it's kind of a widespread...
And the independent media, I'm part of the whole scene of, things like Substack and Patreon and so on too. I'd be more worried about education than I'm about the newspaper end of the world, frankly, about the quality of education and exclusion that comes out of that.
Well, maybe we can learn something, though, from the media, because this seems like the solution isn't government control of it. The solution is actually a reprivatization in a different way than these big corporate superstructures. It's like something nobody could have imagined, perhaps.
And also, you've also got, I know the cooperatives existing, not-for-profit or cooperatives for news broadcasts and so on. So other forms like that.
Yeah, I wonder go ahead.
I just wonder if that'll play out in terms of the educational systems as well.
The not-for-profit model is a really, really interesting one, right? Because it inherently is an anti-shareholder system. And so much of our problems can be traced back to shareholder obligations. You have to grow in order...
3-month reporting and so on, yeah.
Right, exactly. And so as nonprofits proliferate, I wonder if that isn't going to be this quiet switch over to a different system. Because technically somebody who operates by themselves and is publishing a Substack and doing a Patreon, they're not necessarily a nonprofit, but they operate within the economy in a similar way because they're a private individual that's never going to have shareholders. And that's not the goal, right? You, as Steve Keen, never want to grow to the point where you do a public offering of Steve Keen, where, people buy bits of you or something. Or do you? Is that is that a goal?
Well, actually, my Ravel software, the intention is that to sell Ravel one way or the other and get myself out of working on a smell of an oily rag and be able to pull together the 40 or so people I want to work with to build the new economics. That's my intention. So that is my little piece of privatization, if you like. But that'd be selling it to an obviously commercial market of business intelligence. So I don't feel like I'm taking money out of babies' hands to try to do that.
Yeah, would you start like a foundation, a think tank? What is let's say that you sell Ravel enough, you have an LLC, it sells Ravel, you make sufficient profits to be able to start something, you start a foundation?
Yeah, I call it the Keen Institute. Take advantage of my surname. And there's about, in terms of research stuff I'd like to hire, there's about 30 people, all of whom I know personally, as you can imagine. I want to drag them in and say, okay, stop what you're doing, which is working for a university or, and getting 5 hours a week where you do what you want to do. Drop all that stuff, come work for me, do what you want to do for 40 hours a week or 60. And we'll try to build the alternative economics together. That's what I'd like to do. And
you would privately fund that with the capital from your business, essentially.
That's the idea. So
I see. So it is an alternative model, I guess, to having a nonprofit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because the thing with having a nonprofit is that there's all these, well, at least in terms of what we do, because we imagine also being able to give grants for research projects as well eventually down the road. This is like 10, 20-year plan. I don't know. But there's a lot of scientific projects that don't fit under the scope of different institutional programs. And so we're not the only ones who are interested in this. There's a lot of people who want to give money and a lot of researchers who want to do work. And there is some important project in putting those people together. And it seems like the scope of that would be beyond being able to fund it by a single private institution. You want to be able to agglomerate all of these donors with people. You know, there's this money supply just waiting to be tapped. And so there's different projects there, perhaps.
So a lot of people have been talking about the period of zero interest rates on loans as being really conducive to business and innovation and the creation of money. And if interest rates are going forward going to be higher, do you think that that means that there's less money that's going to be available and that it's going to have an effect of clamping down on the economy in the long run?
I think a lot of the money that's been created in the last 30 or 40 years has been financing speculation rather than innovation. So I'm quite critical of the growth in private debt, which led to that decline in interest rates. And most of that private debt going into housings by price speculation and share price speculation, not actually funding entrepreneurs. So I'm not. The low interest rates were a product of high levels of private debt. And funnily enough, the government, the central banks weren't aware that was why it was happening, because they were recording private debt as, according to their model, changes in the level of private debt have no effect on the economy. Mathematically wrong, but that's what they believe. So the low interest rates were a product of letting private debt get out of hand. It wasn't that, we should have had low interest rates all the time. But my father was a bank manager, as it happens, back in the 1950s. And Dad introduced me the old expression that banking should be a 3-6-3 business. Borrow at 3, lend at 6, and be on the golf course by 3 p.m. Okay. So what that means is the banks are the servants of the industrial sector, not the masters. But because the level of private debt's risen so much, and we've such a financialized world these days, the finance sector tells the government and tells the industrial sector what to do, and I think we're worse off for it in both cases. So I'd rather see a lower level of private debt and not higher interest rates than now, but the rates we have rather than the zero. To me, it's more important to get the level of debt down than to get the level of interest, the rate of interest down.
And what immediate steps would you take if you were given complete command over this structure?
I'd bring in a modern debt jubilee, which is one of the things you'll find in my debunking, my manifesto book. So I'd give people money on the condition they pay their debt down. So you create government money, fiat money, use it to cancel. You wouldn't be creating money; you'd be changing what money is backed by. So, like at the moment, the level of private debt in America is about 170% of GDP. Your government debt's about it. Yeah, okay. You don't know that, do you? People think government debt's high. It's about, in most countries, government debt's 1/2 the scale of private debt. Okay. And this is the ignorance everybody has about this stuff. Of course, I know it. This is why I spat it up. But virtually every country in the world, there's 2 or 3 exceptions, but virtually every country in the world has far more private debt than government debt. Now, you wouldn't know it for all the obsessing about government debt levels, would you? But
Oh, go ahead. I have questions already. Go ahead.
Okay. I'd use the government's capacity to create money, to give people money on condition they pay their private debt down. You get a growth in government debt as a result of that, but a fall in private debt at the same time, pretty much 1-for-1 swap. And then with less private debt, people would be less concerned about hanging on to money to be able to pay their debts. And what that actually does, that desire to hang on to money to pay your debts, doesn't create money. It slows down how fast money turns over and gives you a lower GDP. So we would actually have more economic activity out of the same amount of money if we reduce the level of private debt, and that would stimulate the economy. Now, of course, at the same time, I'm absolutely concerned about climate change, and I know we've got to go backwards. We need degrowth, but that's another reason to have less private debt, because if you have degrowth occurring, then people's financial commitments are getting bigger compared to the amount of money being created, the amount of turnover in the economy. So with the private debt hangover, if we're forced to have again to degrowth, which will be one way or the other, either by decision or by the climate forcing it on us, then we're going to have a financial crisis caused by degrowth with the high levels of private debt.
So if you create money at the government level, give it to people, and they pay their debts that they hold to the banks, don't the banks get wildly rich? And don't the
No,
people who...
No, you have a one-for-one swap. So debt goes down, reserves go up in that process. And then you sell the bank's bonds that are equivalent to the increase in reserves. And the bonds earn an interest rate, which is less than the interest rate they got from loans. But of course, it's far safer than loans.
So you also have to have the banks in on this. It's not enough to just give people the debt. You also have to get the banks to agree to buy the government bonds.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, it won't happen. I know there's absolutely no chance of this happening, but you asked me what I'd do if I had the power, and that's what I'd do.
I mean, I think that I believe
it could happen if awareness is raised about the benefits of acting in this way, to the extent that everyone believed it was the case.
And a moral education, right? That sounds so stuck up. But I think that the ways that economics will work best is if people are preoccupied with doing the right thing and thinking in this more long-term way. And I don't think that that's impossible. It's unlikely. It's not how history has played out.
No, definitely not how history has played out.
But we see regularly that there are economic theories that catch the imagination, like modern monetary theory. And we don't have too much time left because we actually have to go in a few minutes. So maybe I need to close this somehow. And so what I want to say is there is reason for optimism because theories do become popular and people do implement them on the level of governments when they think that it will work. And so if people believe that this could work, then I don't see a huge obstacle to it. The obstacle is convincing people that it'll work.
That's a huge obstacle in my experience. Okay, because I started warning about the financial crisis in late 2005 because I thought I'll only get listened to after the crisis if I warned beforehand. And I certainly have got more public exposure and more awareness out of that. But still, when they go and want economic advice, they go and ask Ben Bernanke what to do. So now the mainstream conventional way of thinking tends to dominate even after it's caused a crisis, which is what happened back in 2008.
I would love to get you and Ben Bernanke in the same room and record that conversation.
I don't think he'd agree to it. I would.
Maybe we have to work stepwise up and progressively find larger and larger economists until we can get that to happen. Because I think that...
I mean, the fundamental crisis here is that usually for systems to be improved, there has to be a collapse of the first system. That's true. Usually the motivation to try something new in the first place. And we are endless optimists here, and we're always trying to imagine our way through crises without dealing with collapse, because collapse is often quite painful in the short term. But the short term can be years, so it could be generations. And
that's what I think we're facing with climate change, which we haven't discussed, but that's my main interest now, and I think we're going to have a hell of a collapse.
So why don't we put a pin in it there, and then would you be okay coming back and recording a conversation about collapse?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, that sounds fantastic.
Yeah, that would be really fun.
All right.
I want to say before you leave, I really appreciate what you've taught us today. I don't think I ever totally understood banking and money until today. And so I am very grateful for you explaining that. And it's been really, really, really meaningful to me. So thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. All right. We'll see you again.
I hope to meet you again soon. All right.